Thank you, Nick. First of all, allow me to express my appreciation to the Global Humanitarian Forum and to Mr. Kofi Annan for putting a human face to climate change. I believe that it is about time that the issue of climate change permeates beyond the intellectual, scientific, and environmental and academic institutions and actually permeates down to the grassroots, especially in least developed countries like the Philippines and those represented here today. Just a few days ago, 1,800 political leaders from around the world concluded a global platform on disaster risk reduction and adaptation to climate change. And we actually called on leaders all over the world to finally put disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation and to put the two schools of thought so that we could make it more effective in convincing governments to actually integrate and mainstream DRR and CCA together. Your question, Nick, is in the Philippines, an archipelago of 90 million Filipinos with close coastlines and mountains. Are we a nation at risk? Yes, we are. We are visited by at least 20 typhoons a year. We are a developing nation. According to the ADB, if we do not, the Asian Development Bank, if we do not invest 0.5% of our GDP every year, till 10 years from now, in 2020, we could lose by 2100 in 90 years, 6% decline of our gross domestic product. However, if we invest just 0.5% of our GDP on disaster reduction and climate change, that could actually be averted, and the 6% decline could just be a 2% decline, meaning that if we prepare for it, if we are aware of it, if we actually invest and mainstream disaster reduction and climate change adaptation into our General Appropriations Act, our annual budget every year, we could avert these losses. In a 2001 report of the World Bank, El Nino, which is the longer drought season and the longer rainy season, had caused poverty through low agricultural productivity to rise by a big 28%. And therefore, there is a direct correlation between changing weather patterns and climate change. As chair of the Climate Change Committee and the Agriculture and Health Committees in the Philippine Senate, I go around the country and talk to farmers, and they tell us very clearly from north to south that they don't know when to plant and when to harvest because definitely the weather patterns have changed. Now, on the global scenario, the IPCC fourth assessment report had clearly stated that with a mere 2.5 degrees Celsius rise in temperature, 1/3 of the flora and fauna globally could be rendered extinct, and also a 3% decline in the global GDP. This actually scares us and must be operationalized on the ground through forums such as this so that people would actually understand how it could impact on a first world nation or a least developed nation. The other day, Undersecretary John Holmes of OCHA of the United Nations had suggested two very important messages. And first, that there should be at least a 10% devotion of humanitarian aid for disaster reduction and climate change. And second, the possibility of ODA, Official Development Assistance, devoted again to disaster reduction. I suggested, which was adopted by the parliamentarians and plenary, that perhaps the debts of developing nations could be assessed by the debtor institutions, by the donor countries, and a part of it could actually be swapped for disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation projects. If this is done presently for debt for nature, debt for health, debt for education swap agreements, it could actually, the same model could be done for debt for disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation projects. I think it is a very doable project, especially in the wake of the global financial crisis. Big donor institutions and developed countries don't have to shell out anything. They could actually just assess the debt that these developing countries could have. So perhaps the message today would be for us to rethink development. Has the development that we've done industrialization of all the developed countries, has it actually protected the poor? Has it actually made the marginalized sector actually more vulnerable? Have the sectors, the women and the children in the most rural areas who only live on $1 a day, has it made them poorer and actually more vulnerable? If the answer is yes, then I believe that we must rethink development, that we must be more cautious in terms of development, that we must actually invite more resilient investments, not investments that would actually exploit the poor more and make developing nations actually more vulnerable and progress and development that is actually detrimental to developing nations.
As you are a special emissary on risk reduction around the Asia-Pacific region, what commonalities do you see? Each country has its own challenges and threats, but are there commonalities at the moment which should or could be defined?
Actually, rich or poor, there is one commonality, especially for developing nations. We are all victims of inequity. And that inequity is brought about by three aspects. First, weak urban governance. When there is a breakdown, when there is a corruption, when building codes are not followed, when roads and bridges are not built according to standards because of corruption, then there are risks involved, and therefore it makes those who utilize those public infrastructure more vulnerable to that. And this is, of course, exacerbated by climate change. Second, ecosystems decline. When we abuse our resources, when mangrove areas are actually cut down and translated or transformed into shrimp ponds, when our forests, which should serve as carbon sinks, are cut down by illegal loggers and actually converted into leisure estates or shipped out the logs or for whatever purpose. Ecosystems decline, weak urban governance, and the lack of promotion of rural livelihoods when everybody just converges in blighted urban areas and there is overpopulation in these areas. All of these are risks drivers which actually are complicated with the onset of climate change.
My question, let me open this out, but first to you, Senator Legarda, about how countries at risk can safeguard themselves, not just domestically, in other words, the nation, the national stovepipe on this, but more broadly, internationally. How much is there scope for more initiative, more pressure, more unity on this, and where can it come from?
That's a great question, because everything we discussed in the today should go beyond the halls of this building. First, I believe that the Hyogo Framework for Action 2005 to 2015 must be made into a more legally binding agreement. I therefore urge the United Nations, the IPU, to be able to make all the 168 countries that have have been signatories to the HFA in 2005 to make it a more legally binding agreement so that this framework would actually be implemented in the respective countries. We must also make sure that whatever we discuss today could be inputted in Copenhagen in December so that countries will actually could actually be more committed in the second committed post-Kyoto Protocol in 2012. We must make sure that the developing nations must have a greater commitment towards helping the least developed countries, because for after all, it was mentioned by Mr. Anand this morning, the simple polluter must pay principle. And I believe that developed nations have a moral responsibility to help developing nations.
But do you believe your voice is not being heard because there's not enough unity and cooperation between the most vulnerable states?